Good evening. My name is Harold Mendelson. Tonight's discussion involves looking at the ProQuest database and searching on a topic where we could take two dissertations and compare and contrast them. The topic that I picked has to deal with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I'm not going to get into the justification of this or the reasons why it was done, because it would take too long. I'm going to focus on these two dissertations and compare and contrast them. The first dissertation is from Momoko, M-O-M-O-K-O, Takanashi, T-A-K-A-N-A-S-H-I, Burle, B-E-U-E-R-L-E. It was written in May 2019, and the title is An Exploration of the Physiological Impact and Meaningfulness of the Lives of Japanese American Survivors of the Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Quickly, just to say, in August 1945, we had almost 4 years of war against the Japanese, and they were brutal. The number of soldiers, airmen, Marines, and sailors that were killed was astonishing. We wanted the war over. We wanted to stop the bloodshed. Japanese, historically, would not surrender. Now, with few exceptions, that was proven to be the case. The only time where we had large numbers of Japanese surrendering to the Americans was in the final stages of the Okinawan campaign. Now, the Japanese military suffered 110,000 deaths. Think about that. They had a force of 130,000. And that's an estimate because they couldn't count them all. Some were entombed in caves, others were burned to the point that they were just ashes. So the number of actual casualties was probably even higher. In Hiroshima, it wasn't much better. It was a much smaller force, much smaller location. But out of 25,000 Japanese troops, about 220 survived as prisoners. That's 99% death rate. We were expecting that if we had to physically invade the home islands of Japan. Now, leading up to the dropping of the atomic bombs, we had destroyed 67 Japanese cities. And we first started with Tokyo on March 9th, 1945. Hundreds of B-29 bombers over hours, attacked from an altitude of 7,000 to 10,000 feet and dropped, basically firebombed them with magnesium-based bombs. 16 square miles of Tokyo was gone to the ground, burned. Most of the buildings there were wood. 100,000 dead Japanese civilians and 1 million or more Japanese citizens were homeless. There was an obvious impact on the Japanese war production, but it didn't matter. And we put it to them. We said, look, we're going to keep this up till you surrender. And they were willing, in too many cases, to die to the last man. The Japanese military had expected the Japanese civilian population to fight to the last Japanese citizen. Not kind of thought it might be a nice idea. They expected it. Japanese citizens were trained to resist. They were also indoctrinated on how evil the Americans were and how it would rape all the women and eat the babies and kill all the men. Of course, that wasn't true, but Japanese didn't know that. In Momoko's paper, give you a background here. He was applying for a degree and Doctor of Philosophy and Clinical Psychology. And he goes through the causes of the war. He talks about the ultra-nationalism before and during World War II. And then he went into the various cultural and religious views in post-war Japan. And then went into the review and the studies of the psychological effects of the atomic bomb, and went through the various technical stages. Lifton's 5 psychological stages. The intergenerational psychological consequences of the atomic bomb, and the resilience, I should say, among the Hibakusha, Hibakusha, which translates into people who were bombed. These were the survivors. And then they had the physical trauma that survivors went through and the suffering. And the shared mourning and the various witnesses, reports, and the transmission of trauma. Some of the burns on these people were horrendous. If they were the lucky ones, they died quickly. But some lived I won't say a normal life, but a full life, bearing these scars. Some women that were scarred committed suicide because they couldn't stand to look at themselves in the mirror. I understand all that. And it's unfortunate. It's a whole generation of Japanese and their offspring that had to endure this. Now, as a nation, America came in and did the exact opposite of what happened in World War I. We brought over our experts that helped them rebuild their industry. We actually had them develop a whole new form of government. Women were given the right to vote. It's something that would never have been considered. We taught them how to rebuild their industry. To the point that they became major competitors. In fact, in the 1980s, the concern was that the Japanese government or individuals owned more property in Washington, D.C. than the federal government did. I took a vacation with my wife to Hawaii. And Honolulu is a big metropolis city, building up, modern. Waikiki Beach, all but one hotel at that time was owned by the Japanese. The hotel we were in, you had English subtitles, if you can imagine. So the Japanese managed to recover rather well, as did the Germans. And what we wanted to do and accomplished was to make sure it never happened again. Now, it's unfortunate that the atomic bombs were dropped. And I know that's easy to say, but we didn't have any choice. And you could technically say that the firebombing that we had accomplished had actually done more damage to Japan than the two atomic bombs. It was just the idea that one bomb took out one city. So, the other paper is written by Tomoe, T-O-M-O-E, Osuki, O-T-S-U-K-I. And this thesis was part of a requirements for a degree of philosophy in the Department of Social Justice Education. The title is God and the Atomic Bomb, Nagasaki's Atomic Bomb Memory and Politics of Sacrifice, Forgiveness, and Reconciliation. Now, this paper focuses on Nagasaki's almost inferior complex, because it's basically the city that no one remembers had an atomic bomb dropped on it. Everyone knows about Hiroshima, But not many people today realize that Nagasaki also suffered an atomic bomb being dropped on it. And he goes through explaining his research and his ethics on the historiography of this. And then deals with the kaleidoscopic city of Nagasaki. And talks about various things. He spends time talking about the various communities, and some have Christianity involved. And then he talks about Nagasaki and one of the companies that was involved in the government and what we today call military industrial complex was Mitsubishi during the war. Then they talk about the guy Takasaki and the atomic bomb as a divine providence. The U.S. occupation of Japan for 6 years. And the origin of Nagai's idea of God's providence. And then they talk about the bells of Nagasaki. And the sacrifices made to develop advances in nuclear sciences. And then the influence of Nagis over the Nagasaki Abakusha, which, as I said, is the development of the title they gave the people who were bombed. And then the religious faction of God and the atomic bomb. Then they go into the reconstruction of Nagasaki after the war and how it became a Christian city. And the Christian martyrdom and obliteration and the Buraku community. And he talks about MacArthur's Christianization policy of occupied Japan. And how the recreation of the two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and become the respective cities of peace and culture. And then the effects of the popular symbolism of the atomic bombing, and how the conflict between people that wanted to forget about it as much as they can and those that don't. In effect, both of these papers focus on the aftermath. And both are psychologists. And they understand the impact of what happened. And it's good that they have done this. It's something that needs to be done. And while I can have empathy for them and don't blame them for the war because they were civilians, but the then current Japanese leadership, both in the industry and in the military, what they did is deserve the scorn of every human being. There comes a point when you can't justify going on anymore. And it was obvious that they hadn't reached that point when they surrendered. Well, that's about all I've got for now. See you next week. And good luck with everything. Looking forward to seeing and reading some other people's papers. Have a good night.